The Orion Ember shuddered violently as alarms blared through the cockpit. Marakova gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity, sweat streaking his face in the dim emergency lighting. The shifted planet. As the ship tore through the atmosphere, the hull screamed under the strain. Marek could barely see through the forward viewport as flames licked the glass. The planet's surface came into focus, jagged peaks, rolling plains shrouded in thick mist, and a strange reddish tint that turned Marek's stomach. It wasn't the green and blue of Earth, but something more sinister, alien. The crash landing was a chaotic blur. The ship's left wing sheared off as it slammed into a rocky outcrop. The main hull skidded for what felt like an eternity before grinding to a halt in a barren wasteland. When the motion stopped, there was silence, save for the faint hiss of venting gas and the creak of stressed metal. Marek unbuckled himself and stood, assessing the damage. The cockpit was intact, but the control panels were fried. Sparks showered from exposed wires. Behind him, the others were stirring. Joran limped in, clutching his arm. Ilara was already tending to a minor head wound on another crew member, her kit open on the floor. "Status," Marek demanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. Joran grunted. "Ship's toast. We're not flying out of here." Ilara looked up. "We're lucky to be alive." But Marek wasn't so sure. He moved to the viewport and stared out at the landscape. The ground was cracked and barren, dotted with strange, undulating formations. The air outside shimmered with a faint red haze. He checked his wrist scanner, atmosphere barely breathable and laced with unknown toxins. "We need to get the emergency supplies," he said. "Set up camp nearby. Figure out where we are and what's out there." "Where we are?" Joran scoffed. "We're on some godforsaken rock, that's where." As the crew worked to unload the emergency crates, they began to notice unsettling details about their surroundings. The ground was covered in fine ash that crunched underfoot. In the distance, twisted shapes loomed, structures that looked like half-melted skyscrapers. Marek's stomach twisted as realization crept in. "This isn't just some rock," he muttered. This is Earth." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. A broken highway stretched out beyond the ruins, its cracked asphalt covered in creeping fungal growth. A rusted sign, barely legible, jutted from the ash. "Welcome to Chicago." "How is that possible?" Ilara whispered, her voice shaking. "It can't be," Joran said, but there was no conviction in his tone. He glanced nervously at the horizon, where dark clouds churned like a living thing. The crew spent the rest of the day setting up camp near the wreckage, all the while grappling with the reality of their situation. Earth wasn't the lush, thriving planet they remembered from history lessons. It was dead, poisoned. Something had gone terribly wrong in the centuries they'd spent mining the stars. As night fell, the atmosphere grew colder. Marek assigned watches, and the group huddled together under emergency thermal blankets. The ruins in the distance became even more foreboding under the dim light of the twin moons. Then came the noises, soft at first, like the wind, but quickly growing louder. Skittering, clicking, something moving just beyond the range of their portable lights. Marek grabbed a flashlight and scanned the area, catching brief glimpses of shifting shadows. "What the hell was that?" Joran hissed, gripping a makeshift weapon fashioned from a piece of broken piping. "Stay calm," Marek said, though his own heart raced. The clicking stopped, but the sense of being watched lingered. Morning brought no solace. The red haze seemed thicker and strange. Misshapen tracks surrounded the camp, large impressions almost human but distorted. Marek crouched by one of the prints, studying its jagged edges and unsettling symmetry. "We're not alone," he said, rising to his feet. The crew exchanged nervous glances. They were battered, stranded, and on a planet they barely recognized. But Marek knew one thing for certain. Whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. And it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The morning after the crash brought no sense of safety. The red-tinged haze seemed heavier, muffling sound and cloaking the horizon in an eerie, dreamlike fog. Marek and his crew moved cautiously, scavenging supplies from the wreckage and taking stock of their situation. The footprints circling their camp were still fresh, their alien contours a grim reminder that they were not alone. "We need to keep moving," Marek said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Staying here makes us sitting targets." Joran, still nursing his injured arm, spat on the ash-covered ground. "Move where? The planet's dead. We're dead." "Not if we stick together and keep our heads," Marek shot back, his patience wearing thin. "There's high ground to the east. We'll have better visibility there." The crew packed quickly, their nerves frayed by the oppressive quiet that seemed to settle over the landscape. They trudged through the ash, their boots sinking into the soft, powdery surface. The ruins of old-world skyscrapers loomed like skeletal giants in the distance, their jagged edges silhouetted against the blood-red sky. Hours passed before they found a suitable vantage point, an old, crumbling overpass that provided a partial view of the surrounding wasteland. As they climbed, Marek's wrist scanner emitted a faint ping. "What is it?" Ilara asked, peering over his shoulder. "Life signs," Marek replied, his brow furrowing. The readings were faint but unmistakable, originating from beneath the surface. The overpass gave way to a gaping fissure in the ground, its edges jagged and blackened as if scorched by fire. The scanner indicated the life forms were clustered far below, but there was no way to tell what they were. Marek felt an uneasy weight settle in his chest. "Something's down there," he said. "Could be survivors. Or the things that made those tracks," Joran muttered, gripping his makeshift weapon. Ilara knelt by the fissure, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the gloom, but it revealed what looked like organic structures, vein-like patterns running along the rock walls, pulsating faintly. A foul stench wafted up, making her gag. "We're not equipped to explore this," Marek said firmly. "Let's mark it and move." A sudden piercing shriek cut through the air, freezing them in place. It was inhuman, a guttural wail that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. Then came the skittering. The sound of claws scraping against rock grew louder, echoing from the fissure. "Move! Now!" Marek barked, pulling Ilara to her feet. They scrambled back down the overpass as the first creature emerged. It was grotesque, twisted and asymmetrical, its mottled skin a patchwork of pale, glistening flesh and fungal growths. Its limbs were unnervingly long, tipped with jagged claws. black, lidless eyes stared out from a face that seemed half-formed, its gaping mouth filled with needle-like teeth. Joran swung his pipe in blind panic as the creature lunged at him. The blow glanced off its hide with a wet thud, barely slowing it. Mark fired his flare gun, the bright light striking the creature square in the chest. It shrieked and recoiled, retreating into the shadows. More skittering followed. The crew broke into a full sprint, heading for a cluster of ruins in the distance. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. By the time they reached the ruins, their lungs burned, and their legs felt like lead. They found temporary refuge in the hollowed-out remains of an old factory. Its walls were pockmarked with decay, but it offered some cover. Marek set up a perimeter while Elara tended to Joran, who had a deep gash across his thigh. "Those things," Elara began, her voice shaking, "they're not natural." "They're predators," Marek said grimly, "and they're hunting us." As night fell, the factory became a prison of tension and paranoia. The crew set up makeshift barriers and kept their lights trained on the entrances. But the oppressive darkness seemed alive, pressing in from all sides. The noises outside never stopped, clicking, chittering, the occasional bone-chilling screech. When Marek finally managed to steal a moment of sleep, his dreams were haunted by images of the creatures. He saw their grotesque forms multiplying, their claws tearing through flesh. But the worst part was the feeling of being watched, even in his mind. He woke with a start, his heart pounding. The others were awake too, their faces pale and drawn. "They're testing us," Joran whispered, his voice barely audible, "waiting for us to slip." "They're more than animals," Elara said, her tone brittle. "They're organized." Marek stared out into the darkness, his jaw set. He didn't know what these creatures were or how they had come to inhabit the ruins of Earth. But one thing was certain: they wouldn't stop until they had torn the crew apart. The night stretched on, filled with the constant threat of attack. By dawn, it was clear the creatures were not merely scavengers. They were an apex predator, and the miners had stumbled into their hunting grounds. The morning after their harrowing escape brought little solace. The factory that had served as their shelter now felt like a tomb, the air inside heavy with the smell of rust and mildew. Marek's team was quieter than usual, their faces pale and drawn. Elara, always the optimist, seemed particularly shaken. It wasn't just the creatures. Something about this place was wrong on a fundamental level. While scavenging the factory for supplies, Marek stumbled upon a disturbing discovery. Deep in one of the side chambers, he found a pile of bones, human and animal, fused together by some grotesque, fungal-like substance. The skeletal remains were tangled with black tendrils that pulsed faintly, as if still alive. "They're feeding," Marek said grimly when he called the others over. "This isn't just predation, they're harvesting." Joran turned away, muttering curses under his breath, while Elara stared at the remains, her expression a mixture of horror and fascination. "These growths," she said, kneeling down for a closer look. "They're not just part of the environment. They're spreading." Marek didn't like her tone. "We're moving out," he said firmly. "Pack whatever you can carry." The team pushed eastward, following the faint readings from Marek's scanner. The old satellite uplink station loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the crimson horizon. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to send a distress signal to the colonies, or at least learn more about what had become of Earth. But the journey was slow, and the land seemed to conspire against them. The fungal growths were becoming more prominent, sprouting in clusters that oozed a thick, dark fluid when disturbed. The air itself felt heavier, and even with their breathing masks, the crew began to show signs of strain. Ilara was the first to fall behind. She complained of dizziness and a burning sensation in her skin. Marek stopped the group to examine her, and that's when they noticed it. The dark veins creeping up her neck, spidering beneath her skin like a living network. "It's just a scratch," Ilara insisted, her voice trembling. "I must have gotten it when we were running last night." Joran backed away, his face a mask of fear. "That's not just a scratch. That's them. It's the spores." Marek knelt beside Ilara, his face grim. "How long have you felt like this?" She hesitated, then admitted, "Since this morning." The group was silent as the implications sank in. The creatures weren't just hunting them, they were infecting them. Marek glanced at Joran, who was gripping his weapon tightly, his knuckles white. "We're not leaving her behind," Marek said sharply, cutting off Joran's unspoken argument. "Not unless she gives us a reason to." They pressed on, though Ilara's condition worsened with every step. She began hearing faint whispers that the others couldn't, her eyes darting toward shadows that no one else saw. By the time they reached the outskirts of the uplink station, she was barely able to walk. The station itself was a shell of its former glory. The massive satellite dish was cracked and leaning at an awkward angle, its base overrun with fungal growths. The interior was no better, dark, damp, and eerily quiet. The walls were covered in the same pulsating tendrils they had seen in the factory, only here they seemed more organized, forming intricate patterns that resembled neural networks. As they explored the station, they stumbled upon something horrifying. A room filled with cocoons, each one large enough to hold a human. The translucent, slimy surface revealed what lay within, mutated, half-formed hybrids of human and creature. Their features were twisted and incomplete, their bodies still growing into something unrecognizable. "They're using us," Ilara whispered, her voice distant, "turning us into them." The group barely had time to process this before the creatures attacked. They came from the shadows, their movements swift and silent. Marek and Joran fought desperately, using what little ammunition they had left. Ilara, weakened but still lucid, managed to fend off one of the creatures with a flare gun. During the chaos, one of the cocoons burst open, and what emerged was worse than any of them had imagined. The hybrid was larger, faster, and more intelligent than the others. Its movements were unnervingly human, and its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. The group was forced to retreat deeper into the station, barricading themselves in the control room. Marek managed to activate the uplink, but the data it revealed was devastating. Earth's collapse had been gradual, the result of unchecked climate disasters, wars, and biological experiments gone wrong. The creatures, referred to in old files as harvesters, had arrived centuries ago, spreading like a plague and wiping out the remaining population. Ilara collapsed against a console, her breathing ragged. The veins on her neck were darker now, her pupils dilated. "I can feel them," she murmured. "In my head. They know we're here." Joran raised his weapon, his eyes wild. "She's turning. We have to end this now before she becomes one of them." Marek stepped between them. "She's still one of us," he said, his voice cold. "And she just saved your life." Ilara suddenly stiffened, her eyes wide. "They're coming," she whispered. "All of them." The sound of skittering filled the air, growing louder by the second. The barricades wouldn't hold for long. Marek glanced at the uplink console, its screen displaying a countdown. The reactor could be overloaded, triggering a massive explosion that might destroy the station and everything in it, but it would come at a cost. The skittering grew louder, echoing through the shattered corridors of the uplink station like a living drumbeat of death. Marek tightened his grip on his weapon, his knuckles white, sweat dripping down his brow. The harvesters were coming, drawn by the presence of fresh prey. But it wasn't just the noise that set his nerves on edge. It was the feeling, deep and primal, of being hunted. Ilara leaned against the console, her breath ragged. The black veins had spread across her face now, her skin glistening with an unnatural sheen. Despite her pain, her gaze was steady as she looked at Marek. "You can't hold them off forever," she said, her voice low but resolute. "You know what you have to do." Marek didn't respond, couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. The uplink was operational, the reactor humming softly as it reached critical levels. He had set the system to overload, a desperate last-ditch effort to destroy the Hive and the creatures that had turned Earth into a nightmare. But it needed more time. "Signals sent," Joran announced, his voice strained. He was hunched over a secondary console, eyes darting over the data scrolling across the screen. No way to know if anyone out there heard it. Could be days before... "We don't have days," Marek cut him off. He glanced at the door, where the sound of chittering claws was deafening now. The barricades wouldn't hold for long. Ilara stepped forward, unsteady but determined. "You need a distraction, something to buy you time to get out." Joran shook his head violently. "Number, we stay together. We find another way." "There is no other way," Ilara snapped, her voice rising with a sudden ferocity that silenced the room. She turned to Marek, her expression softening. "You know I'm right. I can feel them in my head, Marek. They're calling to me. I won't be me much longer." Her words hit him like a blow. She was right, of course. The infection was progressing too fast. Soon she would become one of them, another piece of the Hive's grotesque network. But knowing it didn't make it easier. "Take Joran and go," she said, her voice softer now. "Get out while you can." Marek clenched his jaw, every instinct screaming at him to argue, to fight, to find another way. But there was no time for sentiment, no room for hope in this desolate place. He stepped forward, placing a hand on Ilara's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Don't be," she replied, managing a faint smile. "Just make sure this matters." The barricade gave a sudden groan, the metal bending under the weight of countless bodies. The harvesters were nearly through. Marek grabbed Joran, who was still protesting, and pulled him toward the back exit. "We'll wait for you," Joran said, his voice breaking as Marek dragged him away. Ilara didn't respond. She turned to the console, her hands steady as she adjusted the reactor's overload settings. The sound of the harvesters breaking through filled the room, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, facing them as they poured in, grotesque shapes, their black eyes glinting with malice. "Come on, you bastards," she muttered, her fingers hovering over the final command. Marek and Joran ran through the darkened corridors, the distant roar of the creatures behind them. The ground trembled as the reactor reached critical mass. They emerged into the open air just as the uplink station erupted in a blinding flash of light and fire. The shockwave knocked them to the ground, and for a moment, everything was silent. When Marek opened his eyes, the station was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. The fungal growths that had spread across the land were shriveling, blackening as if scorched by the explosion. The creatures that had pursued them were nowhere to be seen. "She did it," Joran said, his voice hoarse. "She actually did it." Marek sat in the ash, staring at the crater. His chest felt hollow, the weight of what they had lost pressing down on him. But there was no time for mourning. The uplink signal had been sent, and with it, a warning to anyone left in the colonies. "We need to keep moving," Marek said finally, his voice flat. "There's no telling how many of those things are still out there." Joran nodded, though his face was a mask of grief. Together they began the long trek back toward the remnants of the wrecked Orion Ember. The air was still heavy, the land still alien, but the Hive had been dealt a fatal blow. As they climbed a ridge, Marek paused to catch his breath. The horizon was bleak, the ruins of Earth stretching endlessly under the blood-red sky. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, crinkled and faded. It was of a green forest, vibrant and alive, a relic of a world long gone. For a moment he allowed himself to hope. Maybe the signal had reached someone. Maybe there was still a chance for humanity, a chance to start over. But as he pocketed the photo and turned to Joran, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever future awaited them, it would be a fight. A long, brutal fight. And they would need to be ready. The book ends with the two figures disappearing into the desolate landscape, their silhouettes small against the vastness of a broken world. In the distance, faint skittering sounds echoed, soft but unmistakable. The harvesters were not finished yet.